drugs, or ideas, what you consume influences who you become. On the Mind and Matter podcast, we learn together from the best scientists and thinkers alive today about how your mind-body reacts to what you feed it. Before starting Mind and Matter, I spent 10 years in academia doing scientific research. I got a PhD in neuroscience where I focused on neuroendocrinology and the neurobiology of behavior, and before that, I specialized in molecular, developmental, and evolutionary genetics. I use my scientific background to help parse and translate the information that guests share on the podcast. In addition to the podcast, I write long-form written content inspired by the show where I integrate what I've learned across episodes. I also have a free weekly newsletter where I provide you with upcoming guests, share links, and provide commentary on scientific studies and research that I'm reading, and more. Visit mindandmatter.substack.com to find all of my content. If you're getting value from this content, please consider becoming a paid subscriber to the Mind and Matter Substack. For just $5 a month, you'll get early access to episodes and other content, full episode transcripts, and I'll prioritize answering your questions in emails and the comments sections. You can also support me by checking out the links in the episode description to my affiliate partners who make various health and wellness products that I use and enjoy myself. You'll receive a discount and help support the podcast that way. And if you want the benefits of a paid subscription, but it's not in your budget, simply sign up for my free weekly newsletter, send me an email, and I'll give you a complimentary paid subscription. Word of mouth is the best way to help the podcast grow. So if you like what I'm doing, please share your favorite episodes with family and friends. The purpose of the podcast is to provide you with information obtained largely from primary sources, the people doing the research and producing new knowledge. This content is never meant to serve as medical advice. And with that, enjoy the episode. Hey everyone, I want to take just a minute to tell you about a really cool health monitoring device I've been using called Lumen. It's a handheld, pocket-sized device with a sleek design. The Lumen device measures CO2 levels in your breath, which allows their technology to determine the extent to which your body is burning fats versus carbohydrates. Lumen helps improve your metabolic flexibility, your body's efficiency in shifting between using fats and carbs for energy. I use this device in the morning or before bed or after meals or after workouts to track my metabolism. With just a couple weeks of use, I learned a lot about which foods were causing my body to burn mostly fat, mostly carbs, or both, as well as how long I needed to fast and how hard I needed to exercise to promote fat burning. Being able to track whether your body is burning fat versus carbs will help you figure out how your body responds to your lifestyle and whether or not your weight loss and fitness strategies are actually working. Lumen is great for anyone looking to optimize their health for either weight loss or athletic performance. Their easy-to-use app allows you to track your results together with what you're eating and how you're exercising, and it syncs with other devices like the Apple Watch. Click the link in the episode description to learn more and use the code MINDMATTER, MINDMATTER, to get 10% off your Lumen device today. That's on top of the site-wide sale they are currently running, and the Lumen device is eligible to be paid for with FSA and HSA health accounts. Check out the link in the episode description for more info. Study?
Yeah, so my name's Rob Barton. I'm an evolutionary anthropologist, but that means that I have a pretty diverse background. I started in zoology, but also did psychology, and have always been interested in the kind of intersection between those two disciplines. Went on to do biological anthropology for a master's and started to get interested in questions to do with the evolution of the brain. And I've resided in psychology departments and interacted with cognitive scientists and neuroscientists, but wound up in an anthropology department. And that's really why I call myself an evolutionary anthropologist. It's a matter of taste as much as anything else. But broadly, I'm interested in evolutionary theory and what it can tell us about the evolution of our own species, but particularly in relation to the brain and cognitive abilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually started out myself. I was a zoology major in college, and I was studying evolutionary biology before I went into neuroscience. And one of the things that I value a lot about that kind of educational trajectory is when you study comparative zoology and evolutionary biology and evolutionary genetics, it really teaches you, it taught me at least, the value in the comparative approach. that even if you're interested in humans, say, you can actually learn a lot by studying other creatures and understanding how and why they're different. And that's very much what you seem to do. So we're going to talk about a lot of different species and comparative biology here, but I think a lot of it will be anchored in the human brain and understanding humans. Okay. What I wanted to start out with is a very simple question. How big is the human brain in absolute terms and compared to other creatures?
Well, it's not necessarily the largest brain in absolute terms, because there are whales that have larger brains. But in relative terms, it's generally considered, when you take account of the overall size of the animal, relate the size of the brain to the size of the body, that amongst currently living species and any fossils that have been discovered so far, humans have the largest brains relative to their body size. So if you compare us to our phylogenetically closest relatives, the other great apes, such as chimpanzees and gorillas, our brains our bodies are not that much different. In fact, we're smaller than gorillas, but our brains are up to about 3 times larger. So something happened in this sort of approximately 7 million years after the divergence of the hominin line leading eventually to us on one hand, and the line that ended up in modern living chimpanzees. Something pretty unusual happened on the branch leading to our own species.
Mm-hmm. And if we look at all of the fossil humans and pre-humans, between the divergence from chimpanzees up until present day Homo sapiens, was the increase in cranial volume and brain size, was that uniform? Was it non-uniform over time? I often hear things, not necessarily from scientists or anthropologists. People often say things like the human brain doubled in size in 1 million years. Can you give us a sense for what did that tempo of change look like?
I mean, that's a really good question, and one which is still being debated. And actually, my co-authors have a paper under review at the moment that has something new to say about that. So I can't really talk too much about that. But in general terms, what we see when we look at the hominin fossil record reflects what we see when we look more broadly across the tree of life, which is that the tempo, patterns and tempo of evolution are tremendously variable. So you don't see a single kind of uniform pattern. You see variation in rates of change, different things happening on different branches of the tree. And we've tended in the past to think of human evolution, certainly back when I was a student, the story was pretty simple. You had a few Australopithecines, and then the advent of our own genus, the genus Homo, and then eventually sort of archaic Homo sapiens. And then the things were, just kind of increasing, changing gradually over the last 7 million years in a fairly sort of linear sort of way. But now the fossil record is so much richer, what we have now. We can see that there were lots of different things happening on different branches of that part of the tree of life. And brain size, didn't change much initially, but it then started to expand quite rapidly. And so the overall pattern that we see is one of accelerating increase towards the present. So, and that's kind of suggestive of some kind of positive feedback process. I mean, we don't really know why, though there was escalating acceleration in increase in brain size. But it is consistent with ideas about positive feedback of some kind, for example, possibly between cultural change and biological change, some feedback between biology and culture. But we've also now, I'll just quickly, we've also now got fossils that tell us that, none of this was uniform. So there are relatively recent hominins with small brains, and possibly we see brain size reduction happening in some lineages. So there was nothing kind of inexorable and inevitable about the pattern. It was tremendously variable, and that's one sort of big lesson that over my career, the data has taught me is that patterns are very complicated.
Yeah, yeah. So different patterns on different branches. Even the
Mm.
pattern presumably changes on the same branch at some point if you just look
Mm.
long enough. When you say a positive feedback mechanism that accounts for this sort of accelerating increase in brain size in our lineage, I understand that we may not know exactly what that is, but in principle, what could that look like? Would one way to think about that be like maybe there was selection for some reason for a larger brain? This sort of unlocked our ability to have richer social interactions and develop a richer culture, which then creates a social additional selection pressure for an even larger brain. Would that be like one way to start thinking about that?
Yeah, that is the kind of classic Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis, the kind of
Mm.
escalating arms race in socio-cognitive abilities. The smarter the other individuals in your group are, the smarter you need to be. And that's one possibility. For many years, the so-called sort of social brain hypothesis really held sway. It's been somewhat more questioned in recent years as a kind of the explanation of everything, but it's a distinct possibility that social life was a really important factor in the evolution of the brain, and that kind of feedback could account for the acceleration we see on the hominin line. But yeah, we don't know, and it's
Mhm.
always going to be difficult because behavior doesn't fossilize. It's going to be
Yeah, yeah.
difficult to say what it was.
The other aspect of human brain evolution I want to talk about is obviously our brains got bigger, but to what extent did the brain just sort of uniformly scale up in size versus to what extent did certain areas become larger relative to other brain areas?
Mm. So you've hit upon, something that is another sort of big debate in the field of evolutionary neuroscience. You've pinpointed it exactly, and I've become identified with what's a position that broadly you can characterize as the mosaic brain hypothesis, which is that and again it goes back to what I was saying about things being complicated. I think it's quite interesting that often people like there to be simple patterns that explain large swathes of data with a simple model. And one of those models was the idea that just everything, as you say, just scales up together. And that's basically the story of brain evolution, that all the different systems and structures within the brain expanded together. Now, that is partly true. But interpretations of what's going on with that coordinated increase vary. So one idea about that is that there's some kind of developmental constraint, that the easiest way to grow a big brain is just to carry on growing it for longer along the same developmental pathway. And that leads to everything getting bigger. But there are other reasons why you might get those patterns of coordinated change. And that's because functionally, the different parts of the brain are highly interconnected and functionally interdependent. And one of the things that we've realized is that when you look at the comparative data, it can be a little bit misleading, because the easiest way to get data on brain structure and brain size and the volumes of or numbers of neurons in different parts of the brain is to just segment the brain in sort of anatomically relatively straightforward ways into the traditional kind of segments of the cortex and the midbrain and the hindbrain structures and so on. But that segmentation doesn't really capture the way that the functional systems are organized, because they cut across those crude segments. And when you start to look at things more in terms of specific pathways and networks that cut across those systems, you see more evidence for mosaic change. So, for example, in my work on the evolution of the primate brain, I got very interested in the role of visual specialization. I don't know if this is a good moment to talk about that, but yeah. Again, this was something that really sort of just came out of the data at me. It wasn't necessarily something I was looking for or expecting to find, but it gradually emerged from the data, and it kind of tied up with what we know about primate biology and behavioral ecology and the importance of vision. What we found is that a lot of the variation in the size of the brain in primates and in the size of different brain structures within primates is accounted for by expansion of the visual system. So primates have, compared to other mammals, incredible visual acuity. Some species have particularly good color vision. Primates do all sorts of different things with their visual system, in particular, visually guided manipulation, which ultimately in hominins led to our ability to make and use tools and that kind of thing. And so when you look at it in those terms, we see, structures within the neocortex of the brain, but also in the midbrain, the visual relays, all the way back to the peripheral anatomy, to the eyes, to the degree of binocularity and stereopsis that facilitates. And you can look at it in terms of the volumes of the optic nerve or visual structures in the brain, the numbers of neurons in those structures. And in all these cases, what we see is relative change, relative expansion of the visual system relative to other systems in the brain. But you'd kind of miss that if you just looked at the growth segments of the brain. So to some extent, that debate has kind of moved on. And I think we have a richer understanding now of what's going on. And it's a combination of coordinated and mosaic change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would imagine that because we have a longer lifespan, humans do, compared to many other creatures, because we have a longer developmental period, early developmental period. Much of the change in brain size can be accounted for by just having more time to build more brain. But as you said, there's also seems to be some mosaicism here. We belong to a lineage of creatures that use vision a lot. So our brain is very visual, I guess you could say. And I guess one way to quantify that or think about that is just to look at how much real estate in the cortex is dedicated to that sense versus other senses. Stepping back from the visual cortex and the visual system for a moment, at least, what about the whole cerebral cortex? Sort of a classic, I guess, cartoon story that you often hear about why certain animals like primates are very smart is that the cerebral cortex is really the important part of the brain that got bigger. Yeah. To what extent is that true?
Can I just preface my answer with a more general point, which is that it's really important to distinguish between explanations for human evolution and for macroevolutionary patterns more generally, and often we conflate them. When I'm talking about things like visual specialization, what I'm talking about is a macroevolutionary pattern that explains a good proportion of the variation in something like brain size across the whole primate order. As I mentioned at the beginning, however, different things happen on different branches, and so that's only a part of the story. There are lots of other interesting things going on as well, and it doesn't necessarily tell you that much about human brain evolution specifically. It turns out actually there are some really interesting data suggesting that there are visual specializations that occurred in the hominin lineage as well, but different kinds of specializations. But to go to your question, which was about the forebrain and the neocortex, and again, to sort of rewind to where I started, when I started looking at these things, I accepted conventional wisdom. I started out with the same kind of assumptions that there is an intelligent part of the brain, which is where all the action happened, evolutionarily speaking, that expanded most during evolution, and endowed humans with our intelligence. And that's the basic story. And really, what I could do with comparative data is go out and test a few ideas about why that might have happened. But over the years, the patterns that emerged from the data again, indicated that there was much more complexity to the story, and actually it is a much more interesting story, because biology is really, is gloriously messy, I always think. And so it's too messy and complicated for these kinds of simple notions to really stand up to close scrutiny. So you will still see in reviews in the literature, in a lot of the literature, statements about the neocortex being the intelligent part of the brain that expanded most. I've even seen eminent neuroscientists referring to it as the pinnacle of evolution. And actually, this betrays another interesting thing about the culture in this field, which is the kind of scala naturae perspective that looks at humans and takes humans as a kind of an end point of a process, and then projects back and expects everything, all the data, to be sort of simply explained by a model that accounts for how you get from, a chimpanzee to a human, or from a shrew to a human. And as I say, that underplays the variability and the complexity. So anyway, that's a kind of slightly conceptual issue. But your question, I think, more importantly, relates to the empirical questions. And as I say, I started with the same kinds of assumptions, but the data led me down interestingly different tracks. And we started to find sort of slightly unanticipated patterns. And kind of one of the first clues to this was when we found that the forebrain, in particular the neocortex, and an area of the hindbrain, the cerebellum, exhibit a very strong pattern, relatively strong pattern of coordinated evolution. So once you've accounted for change in the rest of the brain, in other brain structures, this supposedly sort of basic hindbrain structure, the cerebellum, that has been associated with, basic regulation of motor functions, balance, coordination, and was kind of dismissed as being an interesting evolutionarily and cognitively, seemed to expand in close coordination with neocortical areas. So that goes back to what I was saying about the patterns that we see reflecting very distributed neural pathways that are distributed widely across the brain. What it suggested was that neural systems that cut across those structures, that integrate those structures, have been really important. And we found that in mammalian brain evolution generally, in primate brain evolution in particular. So that meant we started to get really interested in the cerebellum and what the cerebellum's doing. And at the same time, rather sort of satisfyingly, or similar timing, in cognitive neuroscience, people were starting to get interested in the cerebellum and say, hang on, this is an interesting structure. It's involved in some very, complex aspects of cognition and behavior. And we can't just write it off as something that, a structure that's not involved in cognitive processes. And now I think it's very widely accepted that the cerebellum has crucial functions in all manner of cognitive processes. And it's partly, well, to a large extent, it's serving those functions by communicating with the neocortex and particular cortical regions. So we see these reciprocal corticocerebellar networks, loops, that have that project to different areas of the neocortex, different functional areas, and different functional areas of the cerebellum, but have a very similar kind of architecture, designed in a very similar way across those different subsections of those structures, as though there's some kind of general computational process that those different loops with different functional kind of implications carry out. So there's both kind of functional divergence, but also some commonalities. And so that's kind of something that people, both in cognitive neuroscience and evolutionary neuroscience, have become increasingly interested in.
So it was noticed that there's this evolutionary relationship between the neocortex and the cerebellum. They seem to be sort of coupled together in our lineage. Yeah. I guess one explanation for that might have been that, well, maybe there's just developmentally, there's no good way to grow the neocortex without growing the cerebellum, and it's just sort of a side effect. What you're saying is over time, just in the neuroscience literature, neuroscientists have changed their view of the cerebellum. It used to be thought of as purely like a motor coordination structure. It wasn't doing the cognitive stuff. But over time, we've come to discover that it in fact is, and then it would perhaps make more sense that if it's actually participating in cognitive functions, if it's hooked up to the neocortex in very interesting and to a large extent in interesting ways, that maybe there's a functional reason why these things are coupled.
Absolutely. And I think it's I can't remember the date, but it goes back quite a long way that people had dissecting out the human brain, had actually observed that the fibers connecting those two structures are so big, they're visible with the naked eye. I mean, they're these massive connections between them. So it absolutely, makes some kind of functional sense that they should evolve together if they're working together to that extent. I think so. So there's a couple of other implications in relation to what you're saying. One is that the whole distinction, I think, between sensory motor processes as some kind of basic fundamental thing that is separate from cognition, and cognitive processes, which are we tend to associate with humans. And I always think of Rodin's sculpture of the thinker, the guy sitting on the rock contemplating the mysteries of life, the universe, and everything. But actually, our brains didn't evolve to enable us to sit on a rock contemplating mysteries of life, the universe, and everything. That's kind of a side effect of the capacities that we have. It evolved to enable us to interact physically in complicated ways with our world and to plan our activities. And we now know that the cerebellum is really importantly involved in planning processes, not just planning a movement, a grasping movement, for example, but in planning beyond that, planning patterns, complicated sequences of behavior. There's a theory called the cerebellar sequencing hypothesis, which suggests that the cerebellum has a particular role in organizing complicated sequences of actions. And obviously, that could relate quite nicely to what we know about the evolution of tool making and tool use in hominins. So that whole sort of distinction between cognitive on one hand and sensory motor on the other, I think, is interestingly breaking down and has been for some time. And I'm particularly interested in notions of embodied cognition, which is really about, that cognitive systems evolved from the systems that were originally there to control the body. And that's the way to understand the evolution of neurocognitive systems, is how they enable the individual to sort of interact usefully with its physical world. Then the second thing that I wanted to pick you up on was where you talked about patterns might just be, well, you might be able to explain them by development, as though that's an alternative. And to me, that's not an alternative hypothesis. And that it's true that it has sometimes been construed in that kind of way. And going back to what we're talking about, coordinated versus mosaic evolution, one idea about the coordinated evolution of brain structures, as you mentioned, is that it's easier to develop a big brain just by growing everything together. And there was this idea around for quite a while that there might be developmental constraints on how brains evolve, and that if you just tweak developmental timing, then all kinds of things change together. And that might be why you see correlations between, for example, brain size and longevity and the juvenile period, maturation time, and all of those life history variables that you were referring to. But I actually think that's putting things the wrong way around. We published a paper about 10 years ago looking at mammalian brain size and development, looking at the patterns. There's been a lot of kind of focus on lifespan and longevity and the possible role of longer lives in cognition and brain size. But what we found was that there were fairly sort of straightforward connections between developmental processes. So, for example, the growth of the brain in utero in mammals and the size of the brain of the newborn animal, and that already set some of the variation in adult brain size. And then after birth, there was further variation in the time taken to grow and develop. And together, those two periods, the prenatal period and the postnatal growth period, could really adequately account for variation in brain size. And that once you accounted for those life history variables, there was no correlation with lifespan anymore. So the lifespan correlation seems to be a side effect of development, and that emphasizes that there is a close connection between developmental processes and the evolution of large brains. But I would tend to see that as being a case of when selection selects for particular capacities, that has consequences in terms of brain systems, neurons within particular systems, and perhaps overall brain size. And that works by selecting for particular developmental processes. So when there's selection on brain size, to put it simply, then development has to change as well. And in fact, evolution is working through the developmental processes to produce brain adaptations rather than brains being a side effect in some sense of those developmental processes that change for other reasons. And we actually came to the conclusion that the selection on the brain is an important determinant of developmental time across mammals.
One more thing about just sort of brain size and mosaic evolution I want to ask you about for our lineage is, when we talk about mosaic evolution, we talk about certain regions of the brain, like the neocortex, say, or the cerebellum, growing more than other regions or becoming larger in relative terms. This begs the question of relative to what? And I'm wondering if in our lineage, if there are actually structures in the brain, because I've never really heard about this. People like to talk about what got big. Did anything get particularly small and less functionally important in our lineage?
Well, relatively speaking, and this is a trend in primates, the olfactory system, or at least in monkeys and apes, the olfactory system reduced whilst the visual system increased. And that's partly because, as diurnal animals, vision becomes, much more useful and you could do more things with it. If you're a nocturnal animal, smell can be really useful. So that's perhaps the most obvious example. Having said that, the differences we see are pretty much entirely relative differences. So compared to the expansion of other systems, the olfactory system, it didn't change much. So relatively speaking, it looks small. But I wouldn't like to give the impression that it became completely unimportant. So we've actually got no really good, clear examples of where something got smaller. That might be, and it's a good question. I don't think people have looked for it specifically. It could be one of these biases that people are looking for things that got bigger. So there aren't, at the moment, there aren't any really clear examples of that. Again, if you look at the primary visual cortex in humans, just that small area at the back of the cortex, that looks relatively small compared to the rest of the cortex. And some people had interpreted that as meaning that, things other than vision were where all the action was in human brain evolution. But it is a more complicated story than that, partly because some of the areas that did expand relative to primary visual cortex are areas to which primary visual cortex projects. So it looks like those other cortical regions that do interesting things with the visual input have undergone interesting evolutionary change. Again, it's just a slightly more complex story than just vision is relatively unimportant. Mm-hmm. So, not a clean answer for you there, I'm afraid.
I want to ask you some questions about the comparative biology here. So obviously there's a relationship between body size and brain size. You're going to tend to see bigger brains in animals with bigger bodies because they can naturally accommodate a bigger brain. But also we know that it's not a straightforward, perfectly linear story here. And I know that you've studied this to some extent. So obviously a whale is going to have a large brain in absolute terms because it's so huge, and a bat is going to have a smaller brain because it's so tiny. But also I know that certain lineages, including primates and others, the brain grew larger than you would expect purely from the size of the body of that creature compared to other creatures. Can you start to talk a little bit about what we understand about the precise scaling relationships between body size and brain size in mammals, and where certain lineages start to deviate from the norm?
Yeah. So this turns out to be a really interesting question. And I think, in particular, the advent of sophisticated statistical methods have uncovered new patterns in what people had assumed was a fairly well-known and worked out simple story about the way brain and body size scale in relation to each other. And it's also a nice example where I always think it's really important not to come with too much baggage to even the questions you think are relatively resolved, because it can lead you to miss important details, important patterns that change your perspective. And I mean, and in fact, sort of to step back a moment, if you'll allow me, I think it's sort of one of the most liberating things I've found in science is actually being wrong, and we sometimes forget about that. And we think we're building, the point of our scientific work is to build incrementally within a particular discipline. But sometimes something comes out of the data that just indicates that you have to reevaluate a lot. So for many years, actually for over 100 years, since people like Huxley first plotted the size of the brain against the size of the body and showed that there was a relationship, we've known, that brain size is closely related to body size across species. And that's true of mammals, it's true of birds, it's true of everything, really. And furthermore, back then, they established a pretty simple statistical framework for studying brain size scaling and deviations that you also refer to, variability that's in brain size that's not explained by body size. And essentially, that means taking logarithmic transformations of brain size and of body size. And when you do that and plot the data, the log data on a graph, it looks like you have a fairly straightforward linear relationship. And that indicates a straightforward power relationship between the two variables. And that's how brain size was studied for many years. Well, as I say, for over 100 years. And it's partly because, people saw that pattern because they assumed that pattern was true. And so whenever people did a study, they said, well, what you have to do is you have to log transform your data and do a linear regression. And then you can find out interesting things. And until very, very recently, I assumed that was correct. And there was a slew of papers in the past few years that have used that approach, that basic approach, but applied a much more sophisticated statistical framework for examining evolutionary change in a variable like brain size on phylogenetic trees. So to use sophisticated methods for kind of reconstructing evolutionary change and looking at rates of change on individual branches of a phylogenetic tree and studying variability in rates of change and patterns of evolution. And but these papers also still made this basic assumption. And one of the there are a number of sort of findings that came out of that approach. One is that the way that the brain size and body size scale with each other varies from one group of mammals to another, for example, or one group of birds to another. In some cases, the relationship is much steeper than in other cases, apparently. And there are also sort of shifts in the size of the brain relative to the size of the body in different groups, different orders of mammals, for example. And so this seemed to be a story of the kind of thing I was talking about earlier, of biology being complicated, different patterns in different groups. And I'd be quite happy with that. That kind of makes sense to me. Except that when my collaborators sent me the sort of latest analyses one day, and in particular some scatter plots of the data, I kind of squinted at it and went, well, it doesn't look to me like, if you look at the big pattern across all mammals, it looks like logarithmic transformation of the data hasn't actually linearized the relationship. It looks curved. It looks like there's still a curve in those data. And my collaborators are sort of geniuses with these very sophisticated methods and can take about 10 minutes to test any ideas that I come up with. So they said, my collaborator in particular, Chris Venditti, who should take a lot of credit for this work, and Joe Baker as well, who's done some of the analyses as well, has been very involved in this. They said, well, we can take a look at that. And they came back and said, yeah, you're right. It's not linear, it's a quadratic relationship. So we went, well, that's quite interesting, because that's not what people have been saying for 100 years. And the first thing is well, why is that the case? And so far we don't know. We haven't managed to pin down a reason for that particular shape of relationship, but what we have done is find that it's also true in birds as well as mammals. So it might be quite general, at least in homeothermic, warm-blooded creatures. But the other thing that it does is greatly simplify the patterns. So here's an example where, my kind of standard position is evolutionary biology is really messy and complicated. No reason to expect one kind of model to explain everything. And I've had to kind of recant a bit on that in this particular case. but only in this particular case, of brain size scaling. Because various sort of puzzling complexities in the way in which brain size and body size scale seem to disappear once we account for this curvilinear relationship. So, for example, for many years, there was a problem. It was called the taxon level problem. It's quite an esoteric thing in sort of evolutionary neuroscience. But what it basically says is if you compare different species of mammals or different species of birds within a closely related group, so for example, within a genus or within a family of mammals, the slope of the line relating brain to body size is flatter than if you compare more distantly related species, for example, across different orders of mammals from bats to whales. And the various theories were put forward to try and explain this. One sort of popular idea is that there's some kind of lag in the evolution of the size of the brain, that body size can change relatively rapidly and brain size takes a while to catch up in some sense for the developmental mechanisms to make that happen. So that when there's rapid evolutionary change in body size that differentiates closely related species, the correlation with brain size is sort of flatter. It hasn't caught up yet. There are various kinds of explanations like that. But all of this disappears when you account for the quadratic nature of that relationship. And the variability in slopes of the relationship between different groups of mammals also completely disappears. It does seem...
It's a natural consequence of the curvilinear relationship that you guys defined. But if you make the linear assumptions of the people we're making historically, you have to come up with all of these other explanations to layer on top of it.
Yeah. So what we found was that if you fit linear relationships to the different orders of mammals, if you properly controlled for the effects of body size, what you shouldn't find any correlation between the slope of the relationship and the average size of that group of mammals. So large mammals like whales should have the same kind of slope, or shouldn't particularly predict the slope that they have compared to small-bodied animals like shrews and so on. But we found there was a strong correlation between the overall size of the group, the average size of the group, and the slope of the line, indicating there was something wrong there, that size hadn't been properly controlled for. And so that's where the variability in the slope of the line came from. It was a side effect of not controlling properly for size through fitting linear models.
So for decades, over a century, people were, for statistical reasons, for historical reasons, people would log transform the data when they're looking at brain size, body size stuff. They would plot it. You see a scatter plot of data, and then they would fit straight lines to that, which is the default way people often do statistical analyses. And you're saying that those lines, those straight lines, fit that log transform data pretty well.
Pretty good.
But if you looked at it closely, it actually the data looked curved, and it sounds like just no one ever bothered to try and see if something fit the data better. And when you guys did that work, you did in fact find that something could fit the data better.
That's exactly it. And it was a kind of an accident. And I love these accidents. But I also think it's really important to be open to these accidents and to what the data are telling you. And, maybe we just it's so embedded, this idea that the relationship must be linear, that we just don't let ourselves see something. And so we fit more complex models with, lots of different groupings within it to try and account for it. And maybe it was my bad eyesight that made when I was looking at the screen, because I'm quite short-sighted and I don't always have my glasses on when I'm looking at the screen. Sort of made it sufficiently blurry that I could see see that curve there. And then you have to be open to it and go, okay, so well, it's worth following that up. There might be nothing there, but let's have a look. And I do think in science there is a tendency for us to be too influenced by the conventions in our field to the extent that we sometimes lose that sort of playful exploratoriness that can allow us to question something that's really embedded in that, like, just seems it must be true, or it's very likely to be true.
Yeah. I mean, when I look at the data and I try and remove some of my statistical education, this curvilinear line, it isn't that curved, right? It's like almost straight, and yeah, it looks to the untrained eye like there's not. It looks like a straight line, basically. It looks like quite a subtle thing. In some sense, it is, but it turns out to be very significant. If I'm reading it correctly, you're saying that if you basically plot body size versus brain size on a graph across a bunch of different orders of mammals, the relationship between body and brain size, the slope of the line, gradually gets shallower as you go up in body size.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's very subtle, but it's statistically significant, highly significant, because we've got about 1,500 data points in there, and it does account for these other statistical patterns that people had puzzled over and scratched their heads over for a long time. One way of sort of indicating how subtle this curve is I was interested in, well, does that mean, like, if it's quadratic, is there a body size at which brain size stops increasing? That like, if animals got bigger and bigger, their brain size would just stay the same, and what is that size? And basically Chris Venditti poured cold water on that. He did the analysis, and he said, yeah, that's true, but you'd have to be about over 1 billion tons for that to happen. So that tells you how subtle the curve is. But still, it's there, and it accounts for these other things.
And so after you guys fit the data in this way and made this discovery, it had a simplifying effect on lots of puzzles. It sounds like you had all of these things that needed extra explanations before. You needed to generate auxiliary hypotheses because you had all of these mysterious questions that were emerging. And many of those, it sounds like, disappeared after you fit the data better.
Yeah. And I'm not normally a fan of that approach. So in ecology, there's this thing called the metabolic theory of ecology, which says that you can explain all sorts of evolutionary and ecological relationships by simple energetics, the way that metabolic rate scales. And there's a magic scaling parameter of is 3/4, 0.75. And I just don't believe that. But I might be wrong. And generally I don't, because I don't see any reason why there should be some simple underlying relationship that explains lots of complex patterns. So I was surprised. I was very surprised by this. But it's good to be surprised, isn't it? I mean, it's makes your day more interesting.
So, given everything you just told us, when you guys fit the data properly with these nonlinear models, and you look at brain versus body size, you've got an interesting graph here that I would hope you could unpack for us. So essentially, you're plotting a measure of brain size versus body size, and you're looking at which orders of mammals sort of fall outside the norm. In other words, where does body size get bigger more than you would expect from the increase in body size in that lineage? What are the types of mammals where that's true?
Okay, so there are various ways of looking at that. One is to ask which groups of mammals, which orders of mammals So when talking about mammalian orders, I mean things. Well, there are different ways of defining orders, but the primates is our own order. And ungulates would be another group. Although there, as I say, there are different ways of grouping these. I'm trying to use terms that people might have heard of, so hoofed animals, but cetaceans are closely related to those as well. So one question we asked was whether there is a general trend through time, like we know there is for body size, for increase. Is there a general trend for brain size to increase over and above the change attributed to body size? In other words, for relative brain size to consistently increase more than you would expect by random chance. There are various different ways of looking at that. The simplest way is just to ask, how many branches on the phylogenetic tree do we see increases in relative brain size, and on how many branches are there decreases or, no change? And we do find across mammals a signature of a trend in general, but it's restricted to a couple of groups. Well, at a stretch, 3, but I think really 2. And the most prominent group in which we see this trend is our own order, the primates. So the other 2 are the rodents and the carnivores. And in both those groups, there were slightly more branches of the tree on which brain size increased than branches on which body size increased, suggesting a general trend. And looking at it other ways as well, we see a bit of a signature of a trend in those groups. But in primates, it's really quite dramatic. So in primates, on 80% of the phylogenetic branches on the tree, we see increases in brain size. And only about 60% of branches we see increases in body size. And overall, we find a strong signature of a trend for increase in relative brain size in primates. And again, this was a surprise to me. I saw no reason generally for why there should be a trend at all. And in particular, I saw no reason why, if there is, it should be particularly confined to our own order, the order primates. But that's what the data tell us, and this seemingly set the stage for the increase we see on the hominin branch, which carried on this trend, but accelerated it. Again, this opens a whole tranche of new questions, like about why. Why should you see a trend? Why should you see a trend at all? When evolution is, fairly basically a random process. There's no kind of. I'm against teleology. I'm against the idea that there's some kind of final cause that's dragging everything in a particular direction inevitably. There's no reason why brain size shouldn't decrease, and in some cases it does, but in primates very rarely. So why is that the case?
I guess just maybe to set this up a little bit. Like when I look at this relationship, naively, one of the simplistic ways you might think about this data that a lot of people naturally do is, okay, if we're talking about outsized increases in brain size compared to body size, let's just call that something that's driven by intelligence or how smart the creature is. And then you see primates up here, you're like, okay, that fits. But you don't see cetaceans, dolphins and whales with this pattern. You don't see elephants with this pattern. So that clearly isn't what's driving this.
No, and but there are groups within those orders where you do see rapid increases in brain size. So trends is one part of the story, and that's a distinct phenomenon. Does a group show an overall trend in a particular direction? But then the other side of this is just looking across all the branches, can we identify where there has been rapid change in one direction or another? And when we ask that question, we see rapid changes in brain size scattered right throughout the mammalian tree of life. So there are examples. So elephants are one example where there was a rapid increase in brain size on one branch. It's just that across the branches of that group of
I
mammals
see.
generally, there was no consistent trend for that to
I see.
happen.
So it's sort of like all primates or most primates, you saw this trend. But for something like whales and dolphins, there's many different species of whales, many different species of dolphins. Some of
Yeah.
them may have exhibited this trend, but
Yeah.
on average, all of them did not.
So overall, there was no trend when you look at it at the level of the group or the
Mm-hmm.
order. There was no consistent pattern across all of those branches for change in a particular direction. But at the same time, there were some isolated branches where rapid change did happen and resulted in big changes in brain size. Um, so then, yeah, you can ask whether there's something that links all of those different cases of rapid brain size change in different on different branches of the mammalian tree of life. And I people talk about intelligence, and I'm not a great fan of the concept of intelligence, which I think is like really culturally loaded and essentially comes out of Western notions about individual differences and doesn't translate particularly well to understanding evolution and what natural selection was working on. I don't think, I suspect that in those different groups of mammals, all sorts of different things explain those similar, superficially similar patterns in
Mm-hmm.
terms of brain size increases. And I suspect if you look below the surface of the brain in those different groups of mammals, you will see different systems changing. So presumably in cetaceans, the systems that are involved in echolocation in sonar and auditory navigation are probably very sophisticated and expanded. Whereas, as I've said, in primates, it's more to do with the visual system and visuomotor capacities. And I don't think intelligence really captures that very well. You can call it intelligence. You can look for the commonalities in, the behaviors that and perhaps the behavioral flexibility that supports. But biologically, I think that sort of conceals interesting variation in which systems are involved.
Mm-hmm. When we think about the major variables on which natural selection is acting, when we look at these relationships between brain size, body size, and how they're evolving in different lineages, different individual branches of the tree of life, are there any major, I'll just call them ecological factors or life history, lifestyle factors that do seem to play an outsized role in explaining some of these trends? So, for example, predators versus prey animals, aquatic versus terrestrial animals. Are there any clear factors that do seem to push a lineage in a certain direction here?
So this question has been quite debated in recent years. I'll give you, one example of this, and the difficulties. I think not necessarily insurmountable difficulties, challenges, shall we say, for science here. So if we look at primates, and we mentioned this earlier, for many years, the idea that social life was the key selective factor held sway, and the variability in brain size across primates was, apparently well explained by differences in social complexity. And that seemed to be, fairly consistent with the data that we had. But more recent studies trying to expand, the data set and look at it in more detail didn't really support that strongly, and went back to some previous ideas about the foraging niche that different primate groups have, and ideas about foraging for fruit being demanding cognitively, having a a large home range that you have to navigate around, find your way around. Possibly what's called extractive foraging. And again, this would be potentially important in hominins, the ability to extract nutritious resources from, foodstuff, unpromising foodstuffs that, you have to crack open or dig up, extract in some way from some kind of substrate and process in various different ways. Now, I think all of these ideas do have merit, and I suspect that they've all been factors in different groups. But there's no clear pattern from the broad scale analyses of brain size. Now, this is partly, I think, due to what we were talking about at the beginning to do with mosaic brain evolution, that ultimately brain size, you can ask interesting questions about the evolution of brain size and its relationship to body size and how relative brain size has changed in different groups. But ultimately, you have to get a bit more down and dirty with the data and ask about neural systems. Because, I was talking about nocturnal and diurnal primates earlier, and the fact that you see expansion of olfactory systems in nocturnal animals, but in diurnal animals, you see expansion of visual systems. Well, the result of that is that nocturnal and diurnal species don't really differ in brain size. If there is a difference, it's minimal, and you only pick it up in some data sets because different things are changing in kind of opposite ways. So if you're just asking what selection pressures drove brain size, you're kind of missing an important part of the story, and you're maybe to some extent focusing on an unanswerable question, because there isn't going to be a single factor that drove brain size. There's going to be lots of different factors. So where we are at the moment with that is there's disagreement, but my take on it is it's not surprising that you get different results using different data sets. That's one of the things we found. If you just use different data sets, you get different correlations. So that's a problem, and that's partly because the data is really messy. So if you're trying to characterize the diet or the home range area or the social group size of a particular species, there's a lot of within species variation in that. And if you use different data sets, you get different results out. But also this problem of mosaic brain evolution, that it's probably more interesting to ask questions about how particular systems changed in response to particular selection pressures. And then you can ask whether that had implications for brain size, but it won't necessarily always have been associated with differences in brain size. So the question is slightly different there. And clearly, whatever explains the evolution of large brain size in some groups of primates, it's quite likely to be very different to what explains the evolution of brain size in different groups of dolphins and whales. Mm-hmm. It could be sociality in both cases. That's, one argument that people have put. But equally, it could be a bunch of other things that differs between those groups in quite dramatic ways. If you compare an animal that, like a primate that explores its world, learns about its world through essentially visually guided manipulation of its world, with one that doesn't have hands, swims around and explores its world using sonar, then you're likely to see quite different things going on in their brains. And to me, that's the kind of more interesting question. Is what was different.
Yes, and I think what you were saying before that has to do with this is when we look at animals like primates and dolphins, as we meaning human beings with our language, the language biases and concepts that we have, we can say, okay, a dolphin is intelligent, a chimpanzee is intelligent, And that is we all know what that means. It's intuitive. But obviously they do different things in different ways. And what you're saying is that might be an intuitive concept to use that we can all mutually communicate with, and it's sensible to our minds, but it's actually obscuring the biological processes on which natural selection is actually acting. And it's masking the variation that matters here when we want to explain this biologically.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think it's okay to talk about the evolution of intelligence, as long as you bear in mind that that can mean very different things in different groups of animals, and that it is not an explanation in itself. And the problem comes when people start to sort of assume that there is a thing that we call intelligence, and it's fundamentally the same kind of thing as we measure in IQ tests in different humans, which characterizes different species of mammals to greater or lesser extent. So it's seeing other species as kind of lesser versions of ourselves that's the problem here, I think, instead of seeing them in terms of their own ecological niche and evolutionary history. And I think it's a very limited and limiting ways of understanding other species and of understanding evolution as kind of inferior versions, as rungs on the ladder leading inexorably to human superiority. It's a very impoverished kind of take on things that we teach our students in first year, that like we've rejected that notion, but it's still very implicit in a lot of the ways that people think about cognitive evolution and brain evolution. And one example is you'll know about the marshmallow test that's been used in human developmental psychology, and supposedly, so this is the idea that inhibitory control or executive control, as measured by this thing called the marshmallow test in kids, which is like, if you can inhibit your response of grabbing the reward that's there in front of you now, because if you do that, you'll get a greater reward further down the line. And that shows you've got a good executive control, and that's associated with intelligence and all kinds of good outcomes. Now, that idea has actually been exported into comparative psychology and used to explain macroevolutionary patterns across species. The executive control, which is, I think there's a really interesting and very loaded cultural history behind these ideas that we could talk about. I think it's a very Western kind of notion of intelligence, in fact. And I actually think it's just not a very useful way of understanding other species to ask about how much executive control they have, and how that's associated with their intelligence and brain size. People have tried to do that, but I don't think it's the answer. I think it's sort of the idea that, like, if only chimpanzees could resist the urge to act on impulse, then they could have built space rockets and gone to the moon. And clearly that's not the case. However long they sat and thought about things and inhibited their initial reaction, they were never going to come up with the technology that allows you to go to the moon. So it's not going to explain those sorts of complexities and our technological wizardry.
One thing I want to talk about too, and come back to, you mentioned this earlier, is metabolism considerations here, because on the one hand, one thing that you've told us here, one theme here, is heterogeneity and variation. Different lineages. There's many different ways to build a bigger brain. There's many different factors that could drive one branch of the evolutionary tree of life towards a bigger brain of one kind or another. So there may not be, one ecological variable that sort of unifies a lot of this stuff. One thing that does seem to cut across all the branches, as far as I can tell, when we think about brain size, overall brain size is metabolism, because neurons are very expensive metabolically. We know that the amount of energy our brains use is very large for the brain. I forget what the exact number is. The brain is, it's using 20%, 25% of the energy of the human body, I think, something like that. And we know, we know that neural tissue is very expensive. Action potentials require a lot of ATP. And you mentioned earlier that there are these scaling laws, which apparently explain how metabolism relates to body size. And I've had Jeffrey West on the podcast a number of years ago, and he's one of these guys.
Sorry, I should not have been rude about the metabolic theory of ecology in that case.
No, it's okay.
Apologies.
But according to that body of work, you can fit these power laws that relate body size to metabolic rate. And you mentioned that there's this 3/4 power law that a lot of people are fond of. And it basically says that is used to explain why metabolic rate is lower for larger bodied animals, and why you get sort of an economies of scale that comes in there. And this can maybe explain why larger animals tend to live longer and so forth. But given that we know in physiological terms that, neural tissue is expensive, it does require more energy. I would think that there's usually on most branches where you get an outsized amount of brain growth, there must be some metabolic factors there involved in how animals are acquiring food, that are ensuring they're getting more energy dense foods, because they no matter why their brain got bigger and what's driving that ecologically, you do have to pay for it in energy. And so what do you have to say about the role of metabolism here?
So this is a really another nice example of where views have changed over time and kind of flip-flopped to some extent. And also, example where I've had to change my views based on data. And I should here credit my old mentor and master's supervisor. Way back when I was a master's student, I was taught and supervised and inspired by Bob Martin, who came up with this idea called the maternal energy hypothesis. So there were various ideas linking the scaling of brain size to metabolism. And his particular idea, which I think turns out to hold a lot of water, but which for a while I was very skeptical about, is that the growth of the brain is constrained by the rate of delivery of nutrients from the mother to the fetus, and then during lactation to the infant as it grows and suckles. And so he was interested in the fact there seemed to be some relationship between metabolic rate and brain size. And I am, amongst some other people, for years kind of rejected that, said the data don't seem to support that. But more data and better methods seem to have vindicated Bob's position. So one of the papers we did, actually I mentioned a bit earlier, looked at this in terms of development. And we found that in addition to the gestation period, the period of pregnancy across mammal species having an influence on the size of the brain in the newborn, so did metabolic rate. So species with higher relative metabolic rates grow their brains faster in utero, leading to larger brain size in the newborn. And that seems to have consequences for subsequent brain growth after birth as well. And then in our more recent paper, but also other people have shown this more recently as well, so this is not attributable to us in particular, but we found it too, is that when you have lots of data and good methods, you find that metabolic rate and brain size are correlated with each other. And that's after accounting for the relationship that each has with body size. So relative brain size and relative metabolic rate are associated. just as Bob Martin had predicted. Um, so I think what that indicates is that brains, as you say, are metabolically expensive. I wouldn't interpret it necessarily as a constraint that, if there's some reason why metabolic rate can increase, that allows you to increase brain size, and it's generally advantageous to have a big brain, so you do. I think it makes more sense to see it in terms of when selection selects for something that requires a larger brain for it to happen, that it also has to increase metabolism. And so it's a constraint in that sense, but it's a constraint that natural selection works through. And it's kind of the increase in metabolism is probably a side effect of selection on the cognitive capacities that are associated with larger brains.
Hmm. And when we think about things like maternal investment and life history strategies, so thinking about our lineage, primates in general, but humans in particular,
Mm.
um, we have long lives, but we also have these famously long childhoods
Yeah.
where they require a lot of maternal and paternal investment,
Mm.
a lot of care to allow the child an environment where a lot of training can happen. If you think of it in
Mm.
terms of almost like in machine learning terms, we've got this extended period in which we get to play, our brains get to expose to these training data sets, and there's a lot of
Mm.
time that
Mm.
our brains spend learning things that
Yeah.
simply require time to learn,
Yeah.
complex social behaviors and so forth. Um, how unique is that to our lineage, and what are some of the key things there in terms of really the what characterizes the postnatal developmental period of our lineage?
Mm. Yeah, no, I mean, I think what you say is absolutely correct. Certainly for mammals, I think there are strong relationships between, the need to grow brains postnatally and that's associated with, species having generally a large brain, um, and it getting wired up through learning processes, through input from the environment. Large brains take longer to wire up and to function effectively. So, an extended period of maternal investment is probably necessary to enable that to be supported. And I think we do see that so we see, we mentioned elephants as one group where there are large brains, particularly massive cerebellum, I should point out, in elephants.
Hmm.
Um, and they also have, extended juvenile development, extended period for learning. Some cetaceans as well, again, extended period of maternal investment and relatively slow growth. So this does seem to be a pretty consistent pattern, and it is consistent with the hypothesis that, um, you know, having a large brain is associated with these extended postnatal developmental periods and extended learning periods and maturational periods. So I think, behavioral sort of learning is intimately associated with physical maturational processes going on in the brain. Whether the extent to which that applies more broadly is less clear. So, octopuses are a really interesting counterexample to almost everything we know about brain evolution from mammals. So, octopuses have large brains for their body size and amongst mollusks, because octopus is a kind of mollusk. But they don't have any of the kind of ecological factors that are associated with large brains in mammals. They don't like live in social groups generally. They don't have complex social lives. They do extractive foraging, so that might be a kind of a similarity. They don't take a long time to develop, and they don't have long lifespans. So in that sense, they deviate markedly. So they grow their large brains pretty quickly, and then they don't live very long. So something different going on there with octopuses. Some people have tried to squeeze. I mean, octopuses are pretty squeezy, but you shouldn't try to squeeze everything into the same theory, is my take on this. So they're radically different. They've been described as like aliens. And of course, they evolved their brains entirely independently from the vertebrate brain. Their closest relatives don't really have brains. They barely have, they have very simple nervous systems, and they tend to be, stuck to rocks for most of their lives. So all of that is a rather long-winded way of saying that, yes, there amongst mammals, I think there are consistent patterns in terms of life history and opportunities to learn and wire up your brain, but that doesn't necessarily always relate to brain size in all groups. Birds, there might be some parallel cases, for example, parrots and crows, but they don't really have the same extended juvenile periods that you see in mammals. So again, interesting complexity that we're only just beginning to kind of get some kind of a handle on.
Mm-hmm. Another area that I think is interesting, or there's a lot of evolutionary variation, there's a lot of developmental variation that potentially links some of these things together, because there are learning and memory considerations, there are metabolic considerations, and so forth, is sleep. I believe you're doing some work on the evolutionary diversity of sleep in different lineages. Can you give us maybe just a bird's eye view here, bird's eye view in mammals maybe, or even across mammals and birds, say, of how sleep seems to vary in different branches of the tree of life for animals, how that might relate to body size, how that might relate to brain size and things like that?
I have to confess, I'm no longer working on the evolution of sleep. We had a project going a few years ago. But the other people are following up on some of the work that we did, and we were interested in this idea that sleep plays a role in the consolidation of memories, and it's actually it's pretty tricky to study these things across many species of animals, because the data that you need really to study something like memory consolidation are so fine-grained that you're unlikely to have that kind of data for enough species to be able to do these kind of macro evolutionary analyses.
Mm-hmm.
But there are some indications that the amount of sleep is related to the numbers of neurons in the brain. And as I say, other people are following up on this. So some patterns in the data that are consistent with a particular relationship between sleep and the brain, as you would expect. But really, I think at this stage, we're waiting for more and better sort of fine-scale data on sleep and perhaps on neuroanatomy across enough species to be able to say anything really definitive about that.
In the few minutes we have left, what are some of the things that you're working on right now, questions you're asking in your research today that are sort of at the cutting edge of your thinking, and what's maybe on the horizon that you think is particularly interesting in terms of human evolution and mammalian evolution in general?
So going back to the curve in brains, that, as I say, that was a surprise to us, and so we're following up on that. And first of all, trying to find out how general that is. Asking, if that's a general pattern, then what explains it? And does it have the potential to explain a lot of the complexities in other groups of animals as well as mammals? So yeah, we're looking at a variety of different groups now. Um, if that's the case, is it true particularly for the brain? Is it something special about brains and the way that they scale with body size and the architecture of brains, the way that they change as overall size of the animal changes? Or do we see it in other organs as well? Because if we see it in a bunch of other organs, then it must be something really fundamental about the biological scaling of, of different organs. Um, and not something specific, special about the brain. So these kind of more general questions, trying to follow up on that. Um, we are interested in the molecular mechanisms that underlie evolutionary changes in brain systems. So, what sort of genetic changes have facilitated the evolution of cognitive capacities of different kinds, and do we see similar changes in genes across the tree of life? To what extent do we see different changes? So what we call sort of pheno-genotype correlated evolution. Just more broadly, trying to understand mosaic brain evolution. I have other colleagues who are working in other groups of animals to help us to understand whether these patterns are similar in other groups, whether they're different, to what extent they're different, and to look at in more fine-grained detail. And, we've still done things in a very broad brush kind of way. So we've talked about brain structures like the neocortex and the cerebellum, but even that is incredibly coarse. And I mentioned some specific hypotheses that have specific implications for looking at particular systems. So I mentioned this cerebellar sequencing hypothesis. This is the idea that, the cerebellum has a particularly important role in managing, comprehending, organizing, and predicting complicated sequences of things. That might help us to explain how humans evolve language, because obviously, when we're engaging in linguistic communication, we're ordering words into extremely complicated, multi-layered, hierarchically organized sequences. To what extent is that the same kind of sequencing process that we engage in when we're organizing sequences of actions? And to what extent do they use the same brain systems? Are there particular areas of the cerebellum and those corticocerebellar networks that underpin complicated sequences of actions and complicated language? And that will help us to understand sort of the nature of cognitive evolution, I think, the extent to which things that we think of as being or have traditionally thought of as being quite separate, like language. Some people have thought of it as a module. Actually, is it part of a more generalized capacity for this is in this case managing sequence?
I suppose that would relate to things you were mentioning earlier around embodied cognition. To what extent is language this quote unquote pure cognitive thing that's different and sort of uncoupled from the circuits underlying action in the world, sensory motor action, versus to what extent is it an elaboration of sensory motor systems that would sequence any other behavior, perhaps?
Yeah, and traditionally people have tried to describe the language system, so-called language system in humans, as being something that resides in the neocortex. And increasingly, again, with this part of this general trend for finding more that functions are more distributed, finding that the cerebellum, but other structures like the basal ganglia have important functions in language production and language comprehension. finding that those systems are also closely allied to the systems that are involved in gesture, for example. So vocal communication is intimately associated with gestural communication and the more general, sort of, as you say, embodied organization of activities. So we've got a project running this autumn in Durham, kind of a slightly crazy blue skies thing where we're bringing together people from arts and humanities, social science, psychology, cognitive science, evolutionary biology, neuroscience, focusing on this idea of sequences as being kind of the organization of sequences as being a kind of a very general capacity. Years ago in 1950 something, Carl Lashley said that he thought that was what distinguishes humans. So we're kind of following up on this old idea and taking a very interdisciplinary approach to working out its implications for all sorts of areas of human activity, including things like dance, for example.
Well, Rob, this has been fascinating. Before we go, is there anything you want to reiterate for people? Anything that we talked about before, or any final thoughts you want to leave people with about evolution or human evolution?
I think, there was one thing I'd like to emphasize. It's more generally about science, that thing that we forget, about wonder and curiosity, and not necessarily always believing conventional wisdom, being prepared to question conventional wisdom. Because in my own area, this is what has led to, for me, the most sort of excitement and the most interest and interesting findings, and being the most productive thing is where I've kind of allowed myself the freedom to slightly, go against what I had assumed in the past. And so not to always see science as just an incremental process of building on what we think we already know, but to see it sometimes also usefully as a disruptive thing, there being a disruptive part of it, that sometimes to make a leap, we need to be a little bit disruptive. And when we do that, we find out all sorts of there's still interesting things to find out about problems we thought were solved, like, scaling, and that's kind of thing. Be full of wonder and open to finding out new things that just come out of the data at you, essentially, rather than come out of conventional ways of thinking.
All right. Well, Professor Rob Barton, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
This episode is supported in part by Athletic Greens. Their main product, AG1, is a comprehensive and convenient daily nutrition product containing 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients with less than 1 gram of sugar per serving, no nasty chemicals or artificial anything. It's gluten and dairy free and compatible with paleo, vegan, vegetarian, and ketogenic diets. AG1 is a quick and convenient way to supplement your diet to help ensure your body is getting the nutrients it needs. It comes in powder form, and you can mix it in water and drink it, or you can put it into a smoothie or a shake or something like that. I mix it into water and drink it, and it's super convenient. If you go to athleticgreens.com/mindandmatter, Athletic Greens will give you a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Their vitamin D product comes in tincture form, so you just take 1 drop each day. A large fraction of the population is actually vitamin D deficient, especially in winter months when we get less sun exposure. And vitamin D is super important for the proper function of the immune system and for a variety of other things. So visit athleticgreens.com/mindandmatter or click the link in the episode description. You'll get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D with your first purchase.